Oh, it's very interesting. Now, you keep mentioning the 2-degree commitment, and that was made, I think, in Rome a few months ago.
That's right.
And is that now what we're talking about? Are we now talking in terms of degrees of temperature increase, or because before we talked more about parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, the 350.org campaign, which got a lot of attention a few weeks ago when they had their International Climate Action Day, and also tons of CO2 emissions.
That's right,
So is it now just talking in terms of temperature degrees? Now, how does that translate to actual real-life action?
Well, there's a lot of discussion about precisely this question. Is this the right target? Should we be looking at a percentage decrease in emissions in each country by a certain date? If so, what should that date be? Or should we be looking at a totality of numbers of tons of greenhouse gas great greenhouse gases that can be emitted? Should we be looking at it in those terms? The reality is that we spent a great deal of time negotiating this treaty, and at the end of the day, it kind of amounts to the same thing. The thing about a 2-degree target is that we believe that it is a safe envelope. We believe that that is a safe level of temperature rise for the world. We know how many parts per million that actually means in practice. We know how many tons of greenhouse gas emissions that means in practice. So the 2-degree target, in effect, wraps together all of the other potential targets. But what it doesn't say is who is responsible, who has the right to emit the tons of greenhouse gases, particularly carbon, that remain to be emitted if the world is to grow in a low-carbon way. That doesn't flow naturally from that, and that's the big discussion. But you're right, this was a commitment made at L'Aquila in the context of the G8 and G20 meetings, and this is a sound basis on which to build this agreement. What the agreement will include, of course, is not just global mitigation targets, so in other words, targets for reductions of greenhouse gas emissions in countries around the world, but also adaptation, so plans to actually help those economies around the world and the countries, particularly developing countries, to adapt to the new world in which 2 degrees of warming actually has quite serious consequences for countries like Maldives and Bangladesh and others, with greater instability in climate and the effects of significant change.
And that's where much of this climate finance discussion comes into, is the adaptation side of this dilemma. I mean, you have the mitigation to try to reduce the amount of emissions, then you have adaptations is preparing for an inevitable warming of the world, especially for the most vulnerable countries, which also put out a statement of their own a few weeks ago, or actually this past week, I believe, which was very, very strongly worded. I read most of it, and it seemed like they're quite angry, and they're really pushing for a high-end level of climate finance from the developed world to actually help them adapt. And this seems like a major sticking point, actually, maybe even more complicated than the mitigation aspects of it. I mean, are these two things, are they divisible? I mean, should they be handled separately, or is this the best and proper way to actually deal with it is together, finding our mitigation and adaptation at the same time? It seems like a much to bite off.
Yes, it does, and of course that's right. The reality is that in these big global negotiations, and this is as true on issues to do with the arms trade as it is on global warming, the reality is that unless you bundle these issues together and create the trade-offs that then help you in terms of the very difficult decisions that countries have to take a hit in one place, to get something somewhere else. Unless you bundle those things together, you don't create that dynamic in the negotiations, and that's what these big global negotiations are really all about. So you have to keep all of those things together. But you're right. Let's just stop for a moment on adaptation. Again, this is an area where we're making progress. What's difficult about this? Well, what's difficult is, if you're going to transfer $100 billion worth of financing each year to the developing world, how do you know that that's actually going to go to mitigating the effects of climate change, helping countries to adapt? How do you do that? Well, you have to build some kind of accountability nationally. So what we're talking about at the moment is national action plans for adaptation for each of the countries that are going to be recipients of this financing. And then, how do you manage accountability for that to the global community? Well, you're probably going to need some kind of governance machinery, some body or other that's going to regulate where the money goes and keep checking that countries are actually doing what they're supposed to do. So some form of register of the national mitigation efforts, the adaptation efforts of these individual countries, and then a means of managing the financing through that system. And again, this is quite an exercise in intervention in the sovereignty of nations. Do I willingly say, yes, I'm going to allow you to inspect what I'm doing, and then when I get it wrong, to tell me and to hold me to account to the global community? In which case, who's going to take these decisions? What does that body actually do? Who sits on it? Who takes those decisions? Who can tell me that I've got to change the way my economy works? And you multiply this across 192 nations, you see you've got a very complicated piece of machinery. And I come back to the complexity of the deal. It's very complex, and it touches on the interests of nations in a very deep way, on national economic sovereignty. Now, we in the UK say we've got to take these risks. We've got to get out ahead. This is why we've committed, as you mentioned earlier, to 80% greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2050. We've committed, and the first in the world, to legislate this into law. So we actually have this as a law in the United Kingdom. We have 5-year carbon budgets, so that we know that every 5 years we've got to go back to Parliament, we've got to account to Parliament for what we're doing, so that we can see, we hold ourselves to account through our own parliamentary system, to our people. We've actually done what we said we'd do, and we're on target. We're looking at greenhouse gas emission reductions of 24-25%, by sort of 2018 or so, maybe 35-36%, we hope, by 2020, in excess of the commitments that, therefore, the European Union has made by 2020, because even though this represents a huge economic transformation for us, it's one that we know is necessary, and we have to show leadership. But also, this is about opportunity. What we've got to stop thinking about is somehow that this is a terrible problem for the world, and this change in the economy is somehow the end of an era. Actually, it's the beginning of a new era. It's the beginning of a low-carbon era, a sustainable global economy. And the countries that adapt quickest will be those that capitalise on these economic opportunities. So we encourage everybody to be part of this, to change the mindset and to think about the opportunity that this represents. And then, that's the framework in which we move on and start to tackle some of the other big problems associated with demography, with the growing population in the world, access to clean water, the Millennium Development Goals. We're off target in a number of those. What we've got to do is use this as a framework then to start to move on and to tackle some of those in a deeper way than we've been doing up until now.